Good afternoon, everyone. I like a small, intimate audience. My name is Robert Thomas, and I have my own consulting business, and I serve the educational needs of the cannabis industry, particularly in the field of heavy metal determinations. I've been in this field for almost 50 years, and about 3 years ago, I ventured into the cannabis industry. And it looked attractive, a little chaotic, but something that I love working in. So today, I'm going to focus on heavy metals in cannabis products and what we can learn from the pharmaceutical industry. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to contribute to this session. Very much appreciated. And I'd also like to acknowledge the financial support of Shamazu Scientific Instruments for allowing me to participate. Okay, so let me dive straight in. This is a rough overview of my presentation. I'll start with the current status of heavy metal regulations for cannabis and particularly the fractured nature of a state-based system. And then I'll give you an historical perspective of how the pharmaceutical and dietary supplement industries approach regulating elemental impurities after using a colorimetric precipitation test for over 100 years, which was totally inadequate, and the process of moving from that sulfide colorimetric test to using plasma spectrochemistry. And then I'll address what the cannabis industry can learn from the pharmaceutical industry, particularly with the risk assessment approach that the pharmaceutical industry took to bring in meaningful elemental impurity regulations in drug products and substances. And then I'll get my crystal ball out and give you my thoughts of where I think the cannabis industry is going with regard to heavy metals and elemental impurities. Okay, so where is cannabis legal in the US today? Here's a map. It's fairly current. The light green states represent states where medicinal cannabis is legal, and dark green where both medicinal and recreation is legal. It is legal for medicinal purposes in 18 states, but the heavy metal regulations are very fractured and very disjointed. So let me give you a brief look, a snapshot of heavy metal regulations. So the majority of the 37 states in the US regulates the big four: lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury. New York adds nickel, chromium, copper, zinc, and antimony. Maryland, Missouri, and a few other states add chromium to the big four. Michigan also includes inorganic arsenic and not total arsenic, but also adds chromium, copper, and nickel to the big four. Some states require heavy metals in the cannabis plant, while others give different limits for the different delivery methods, which is oral, inhalation, and transdermal. Some states stipulate consumption per day, while others take into consideration the body weight of the consumer. Some states have no heavy metal limits at all. So it begs the question, what does New York State know that all the other states don't know, because they add an additional 5? Why does Michigan regulate inorganic arsenic, where all the other states just specify total arsenic? So these are all questions which are unknown, and there's no real resolution to them, but they are just the fractured nature of state-based systems. And the bottom line is that we have to look at these state-based systems and consider whether it's worth improving them, expanding the elemental panel that's currently in place today, or maybe looking at speciated analysis. These are sort of questions which need to have answers to, I think, before eventually federal regulators come along. Okay, this table is a list of the 9 elements that are regulated by the states in the left-hand column, and going across from left to right, The first three columns are USP Chapter 232 PDE limits for drug products, Chapter 2232 limits for dietary supplements, the American Herbal Pharmacopeia limits for botanicals and herbal products, and then going across 6 different states: California, Cobalt, Maryland, New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. A few things to point out. The federal limits are based on micrograms per day. So with most pharmaceuticals, they have a maximum dosage or a suggested dosage per day. So the data in the first 3 columns must be divided by the suggested dosage for those particular products. So for example, if 10 gram is the maximum consumption per day, they must be divided by 10. If you look at the state-based limits, you'll find that some are in microgram per gram, some are in part per million, and some of them are in milligram per kilogram. So unless you're an analytical chemist and you're used to dealing with different units, as a consumer and other people who are working in this field, they might not have a good understanding of how these limits are the same or are different. So if you look at the state-based limits and compare them with the federal limits, just taking lead as an example, which is in the top row in red, you can see they are all very different. And this is fairly typical of most states in the US. So why don't we take a look first at the federal limits and then at a few state-based limits, and we'll try and get a better understanding of what needs to be done. Okay, so the first slide are the federal limits for USP Chapter 232 for elemental impurities in drug products and substances. ICH-Q3D are similar limits. ICH-Q3D is a consortium of pharmaceutical manufacturers in other parts of the world, including Pharmacopeias from the US, from Japan, and from Europe. So the USP and the ICH aligned their methodology together during the 20 years it took to actually bring these limits out. So a couple of points to emphasize. The class or the category is the toxicity classification of each of those elements, and I'll talk more about that later. But basically, these are they are based on 3 different delivery methods or administration methods: oral, parenteral, and inhalation, and they are in microgram per day. So if you need to know what's allowed in the actual product, you divide by the maximum dosage. So if it's 10 grams, for example, you divide those by 10. So I think it's important to understand that these, it took a total of 20 years to bring these into the public domain. And I'll talk a little bit about the process of the pharmaceutical industry, particularly United States Pharmacopeia, and how they arrived at that process. Okay, so this is Chapter 2232. So this is the limit for dietary supplements and nutraceuticals only. You'll find there's only 4, not 24. And there's a reason behind that, which I'll explain later. But what you might notice is that for arsenic and mercury, they require speciated forms of the arsenic. We know that inorganic arsenic is more toxic than organic arsenic. And because many plants and herbal supplements are grown from plants, the requirement here is if the total arsenic is above the PDE limit per day, you have to speciate. You have to find out what is inorganic and what is organic. We know that pentavalent and trivalent arsenic is extremely toxic compared to organic arsenic. The arsenic sugars and monomethyl arsenic acid, they are toxic, but they're not as toxic as inorganic arsenic. And with mercury, because many dietary supplements are made from kelp products or fish oil, there's a likelihood of there being high mercury in some of these products, mainly because mercury, once it gets into aquatic systems, is consumed by bottom feeders, and then it bioaccumulates up the food chain, and the predator fish have much higher mercury levels in them than the bottom feeders. So there is a chance in a dietary supplement that's made from kelp or a fish oil, it could contain high levels of mercury. Okay, so let's look at a few of the states for comparison purposes. I picked California because we're in California. I thought it'd be a good one to start. And these are pretty straightforward. They're categorized by two different categories: inhalable cannabis goods and all other cannabis goods. And these are in microgram per gram. And these are actually the same as USP Chapter 232 for inhalation drugs and oral drugs, based on 10 gram of consumption. But I think it's fair to say that we have no way of really knowing in what quantities people consume cannabis. So is 10 gram a realistic dosage? I don't know. Maybe it is, but we don't really know how people consume cannabis and in what quantities. And also what's unique about the California regulations is that they require a half a gram a sample to digest to carry out the heavy metal determination, where most other states don't put a stipulation on the minimum weight. Here's Colorado. They're a little bit different to explain. Basically, they're categorized in three different areas: substance, which is the heavy metal of concern, the acceptable limits per gram of intended use, and then the products to be tested. A few points to emphasize here. The inhaled products are derived from USP Chapter 232 inhalation PDEs. The topical or transdermal limits are based on FDA limits for cosmetics, and the oral consumption limits are based on Chapter 2232 for dietary supplements. So Colorado has taken an approach of using many, many different sources to regulate heavy metals. Okay, this is Connecticut. This is rather unusual because you need to know the body weight of the consumer before you know the maximum allowable limit. In Connecticut, this is a microgram per kilogram of body weight per day. So it's typical to use 60 to 70 kilogram as an average body weight for a human, both male and female. But you don't know the suggested dosage per day, so you can't work out the maximum allowable limit in Connecticut. Okay, this is a study that was put out by the FDA recently, the Botanical Review Team of the Office of New Drug Products at the US FDA, and they looked at 8 different medical cannabis programs, state-based medical cannabis programs, and compared them with the federal limits of USP Chapter 232. So if you look in the left-hand column, you see the 4 heavy metals of concern: USP Chapter 232 inhalation limits and Chapter 232 oral limits. And going across the table, you will see the limits for 8 different state-based systems. It doesn't tell you what the state-based system, which states they are. They just call them MCP 1 to 8. But as you can see, the data in red shows inconsistency and are higher than the federal USP Chapter 232 limits. And that's quite common across all the different medical cannabis programs. And this study came to 3 conclusions. It said testing for these 4 heavy metals in inhalation and oral drugs was lacking in the majority of MCPs. It was about 75%. And even when present, they were inconsistent across programs, and finally, they did not always align with USP recommendations. So again, this shows the fractured and the disjointed nature of state-based limits compared to federal limits for pharmaceutical products. Okay, let's tell you a little bit about United States Pharmacopeia. I've worked very closely with the United States Pharmacopeia over the past 15 to 20 years. I work on the ACS Committee for Reagent Chemicals. I lead the heavy metal task force, and when USP was writing its methodology for elemental impurities in pharmaceuticals, our ACS committee worked very closely to align the method we were working on for heavy metals with the method that USP was working on. So who are the USP? What is their mission? Well, It's an independent, non-profit, and it's not part of the government, although they do work with various government agencies around the world. And their mission is to improve the health of people through public standards. And these public standards are known as United States Pharmacopeia National Formulary, or USP-NF for short. And it's a book of compendial standards for drug substances and products. And they've been around for about 200 years, and they're recognized in about 130 countries. And the FDA designates the USP-NF as the official compendium of drugs sold and marketed in the US. Okay, so what is the USP process to change a standard method or a monograph? So this is a process which is a little bit cumbersome in nature because it revises standards through a unique public collaborative process with scientists in industry, in academia, in standards organizations. And the ACS was one of the interested stakeholders in the way the USP would change in their methods. So I lead the Heavy Metals Task Force at the ACS, so we work very closely with them as we were both changing our methodology for heavy metals. I'll talk a little bit more about the methodology in a minute. But it had been around for 100 years. It was a colorimetric precipitation test, which was semi-quantitative at best, but it didn't give you any indication of the individual heavy metals. And the USP method was described in USP Chapter 231, and in the ACS, we developed it, put it into our book of reagent chemicals. And both methods were very similar. And because ACS grade reagent chemicals are recommended by the United States Pharmacopeia in any analytical procedures, we had to make sure that our method aligned exactly with the USP method. So that process took a number of years. It took a lot longer by USP, but we wanted to make sure that whatever USP was doing, the ACS method was aligned with it. So on the left-hand side, you see the book of reagent chemicals. It used to be a hardback book. It's now completely online. It's a database, searchable database, so it's available anywhere in the world at any time. So you can search any monograph which is in the book. And based on that, United States Pharmacopeia, in their general notices and requirements, recommends that if any pharmaceutical manufacturers are using reagent chemicals for testing procedures, they must be ACS-grade reagent chemicals. So that's the reason we work very closely with them. Okay, let me explain briefly what USP Chapter 231 is, which is very similar to the ACS test. It's based on a sulfide colorimetric precipitation test with an organosulfide at a pH of 3. And when you do that, you precipitate the heavy metal. It comes down as a sulfide, and it makes a very cloudy, colloidal type suspension solution. And our ACS test was very similar to the USP test, except we used hydrogen sulfide instead of an organosulfide. But both were semi-quantitative at best and probably qualitative, really. Because you only made the comparison against a lead standard. So no matter how many elements you were trying to assess in a sample, you were only comparing it against a lead standard. So clearly it had many limitations. So let's look at those limitations. This slide shows 12 different sulfide precipitates. If you can imagine all 12 of those elements were present in the same sample, how difficult it would be to compare a combined precipitate against a lead standard, which is circled in red. So it was non-specific. It only gave you an approximation of what elements, what heavy metals were present in your sample. It also had a lousy detection capability, limit of quantitation about 5 ppm, which is totally inadequate by today's standards. It required a high sample weight, about 5 gram. And the accuracy was dependent on the experience of the analyst. So someone who'd been doing it for years would normally get a better assessment than someone who just started doing it. So it was very subjective. So it was clearly a method that needed to be changed, and it was quite surprising that it did last over 100 years. 1908 it was developed. So what is the timeline to adopt these changes? It started in 1995. USP Pharmacopeia Forum identified issues with Chapter 231. In 2000, an article in the journal Pharmaceutical and Biomedical Analysis investigated ICP-MS as an alternative technique, but it wasn't for another 4 years when Nancy Lewin and co-workers at Bristol Myers Squibb came out with a study which compared ICP-MS against Chapter 231 and so showed serious limitations in it. And then it took another 12 years for the USP to get their act together through various expert committees, working groups, stakeholder meetings, which the ACS were involved with to discuss this change. And then in January 2018, USP came out with Chapters 232 for element and impurities in drugs, and Chapter 233, which was the methodology used using plasma spectrochemistry together with microwave digestion procedures and comprehensive validation protocols. Chapter 2232, by the way, came out a couple of years before that, so that took a little quicker to, that came into the public domain a couple of years earlier. As an example of the limitations of Chapter 231, here's a slide in comparing recoveries of USP Chapter 231 method against ICP-MS. ICP-MS is in red, Chapter 231 is in green. You can see the majority of the elements by Chapter 231 are less than 50% recovery, and some of them are less than 10% recovery. And mercury, there was no recovery at all. Mercury is a very volatile element. Unless you're very careful with sample preparation, you can completely lose it. So that just showed the limitations of Chapter 231. So from that point on, 2018, ICP-MS and ICP-OES became the standard method to use. So what they did, they separated out the PDE limits for pharmaceuticals only. They called this Chapter 232. They had a separate chapter for dietary supplements because that's the way they were regulated in other parts of the world. They called this Chapter 2232, and they implemented a totally different chapter for the analytical methodology, which included ICP-OES or ICP-MS, microwave digestion, and comprehensive validation protocols using spike recovery procedures. So what are the potential sources of elemental impurities in drug compounds? This is the process they went through to find out what were the potential sources and what was the toxicity of the elements which could be found somewhere in the manufacturing process. So basically, they separated out into 4 different categories, 4 different groups. Elements intentionally added as a part of the manufacturing process. An example of that would be platinum group catalyst elements in the organic synthesis of many drug substances or APIs. Also elements that are not intentionally added, and that could be something that's in an excipient such as talcum powder, which is used as a tablet compression aid, and talcum powder is basically magnesium silicate, which is dug out of the ground, and we know if anything is mined or dug out of the ground, it can potentially contain high levels of transition and heavy metals. The third category was elemental impurities that can be introduced from contact with the manufacturing equipment, and examples of that are iron, chromium, and nickel from stainless steel containers and vessels. And finally, elemental impurities that could leach out of the drug substance from plastic containers and closure systems. We know that some plastics are dirtier than others, and we know that some glassware is dirtier than others. So if the enclosure or the packaging system was based on plastic or glass, there was a chance of metals leaching out of that into the product. The bottom line was that regulators required all pharmaceutical manufacturers to have a comprehensive understanding of their manufacturing process and to find out where the contact points for those various metals were, and then actually and categorize those elements by their toxicity classification. I'll explain that in a minute. Okay, so toxicity classification. Here's Chapter 232, a little bit different. This is now microgram, okay, not microgram per day, but this is now microgram per gram in the pharmaceutical product based on 10 grams of maximum of suggested dosage per day. And the second column, you see classification. Well, every element of those 24 elemental impurities was classified by the toxicity classification, Class 1, Class 2A, Class 2B, and Class 3. There were a few changes recently, and the ones in red are the ones that they've changed very recently within the past 12 months. And this version of Chapter 232 that I downloaded still had those in red. Okay, so let's look at the toxicity classification. Basically, Class 1 were elements including the classic heavy metals, lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury, which are human toxicants and have no use in the manufacture of drugs whatsoever. These should be monitored at all times and every time. Class 2A elements were also toxic, but not as toxic as Class 1, but they had a high probability of occurrence in the drug product and should also be evaluated at all times. And then Class 2B elements were the elements which have a reduced probability, but should only be monitored if they were present in the manufacturing process. Example of that would be the platinum group metals using catalysts in the organic synthesis of many drugs. And Class 3 elements, which have a relatively low abundance toxicity by the oral route, but would warrant justification for inhalation drugs and those used for intravenous purposes. So with that as background information, this is the process that USP took to categorize the 24 elemental impurities which are required in all pharmaceutical products today, up to 24, but it's based on a risk assessment approach to see what contaminants are present and the likelihood of them being present in the manufacturing process. So if we now take a jump into cannabis products, we can see that the first area of concern is cultivation, of course. I mean, we fully understand that. And if the plants are grown outdoors, the soil chemistry has to be assessed and evaluated. So it's important to do that because we know that cannabis and hemp are hyperaccumulators of all contaminants in the soil, whether it's heavy metals, toxic elements, radionuclides. So we know that after Chernobyl in 1986, hemp was planted to clean up the contaminated soil in Chernobyl. So we know that through anthropogenic activities, there's been a ton of environmental pollution over the year, from mining, from metal refineries, petrochemical plants, coal-fired power plants, and there's a whole slew of elements where there's compelling evidence in the public domain that the cannabis and hemp plants are absorbing those. And we know lead in particular is of great concern because our decades of using lead-based materials included leaded gasoline, leaded paint, and leaded water pipes. We know that soil near major highways contains much higher levels of lead than soil away from major highways. We know that leaded paint can be a problem. I live in a house that was built in 1747. Before we moved in, we had to get a crew in to completely remove the lead paint from the windowsills and the paint on the walls. And it was a major, major problem, but we had 2 young children at the time, and it was something that we were extremely concerned about because lead paint was used for decades. And then lead water pipes. We saw what happened in Flint, Michigan back a few years ago. And unless you have a clean water supply, if you're using water for your cannabis and hemp, whatever's in the water will clearly, there's a high chance it'll get into the cannabis product. Fertilizers, we know that fertilizers made from phosphate rock, phosphate fertilizers can potentially contain high levels of heavy metals and transition metals, so we have to be really particular about the quality of fertilizers and nutrients that we use on cannabis and hemp. We know that fish emulsions, fish extracts are being used nowadays as nutrients, particularly for indoor growing. And based on the fact that we know that fish, based on bioaccumulation of mercury, if there's mercury spewing out from, say, a power plant and it ends up in an aquatic system, and the predator, the large fish, will have much, much higher levels of mercury. If those fish are used for fish emulsions as nutrients for indoor plants, there's a good chance that that mercury will be transferred to the plant. And we know it's in the public domain that growth enhancers are being used. For example, nickel salts are used to enhance bud size, and silicates are used for shoot strength. The point I'm making is that the majority of these elements would escape the scrutiny of state-based regulators. And if you don't know, if it's present there, you're never going to find it because most states just regulate the big four. If it's in New York, maybe Michigan, and maybe a few other states, you might find chromium, but the majority of these elements are not being regulated today. So the next source is extraction and processing and manufacturing. So this is a potential source as well. If the cultivation process has given you a plant which is highly contaminated or slightly contaminated, the extraction process is not going to remove those heavy metals. So if it's in the flower or the biomass, there's a very high chance it will be in your extracted cannabinoid. And we know that depending on the extraction process will dictate how much metal is extracted. And we know, again, it's in the public domain that certainly some solvents, depending on the flows and the pressure and the temperature, will produce a different extract. Some will be more efficient, some will be less efficient, but there has to be a balance between efficiency of cannabinoid extraction and taking contaminants out of the plant. And so there's a balance to be made there, and it's something which I think is a potential concern going forward, because maybe efficiency of the cannabinoid is probably the major factor behind extraction, and maybe they're not so concerned about the elemental or any contaminants present. So I think there's some serious concern there. Also the processing of grinding equipment, again from stainless steel, chromium, nickel and iron. I remember a case in my state, Maryland, where a processor was using stainless steel scissors, and they were finding high levels of chromium in the flour, and it was coming from the stainless steel scissors. Unbelievable, but it was true. And also finally, storage and delivery devices. Glass dropper bottles, for example, if they're made of borosilicate glass, okay, guaranteed you'll be taking heavy metals out of the surface of the glass. So quartz should be used, or a higher purity glass, but definitely not borosilicate. So if there are bongs made of glass, they should be made of high purity, or at least made of quartz and not borosilicate. Inks are notorious for being lead-based. There's lots of lead-based inks out there. So an example recently where a study was done looking at extract in a graduated bottle, and what was happening was the extract was dissolving the lead-based ink and ending up in the extract, and they did some studies over time, and they ended up at some of the samples were 30 to 50 part per million, where the regulated limit for lead in that state was 0.5 part per billion. So these things are not fully understood, and things happen, and before you know it, you have a contaminated product. And of course, vape pens. I mean, I could spend an entire talk about vape pens, but basically, there's a lot of stuff coming in from overseas, from China in particular, which is not high quality. They contain various metallic components, and if you're vaping at temperatures, you're going to be corroding the inside of those components, and we know that based on elevated aerosol vaping temperatures, that you're not only corroding the metal from the internal components, but it's existing in the particulate form. There's been work done which is using scanning electron microscopy and energy dispersive XRF, which is showing small particles of metal in the aerosol, which correlates with what was in the vaping device. There's been a couple of there's been some sort of product recalls over the past few years. I kind of look for them because that's what I do. It's my thing, heavy metals, to understand them. And I've counted 15, in the past 12 months, I've counted 15 recalls. And I'm sure there are more, but they're the only ones that are in the public domain that I've found. And there's 5 of them up on the screen there. 2 were in Florida, 1 was in Hawaii, 1 in Maryland, 1 in Michigan. 2 involved vape pens in Hawaii and Maryland. In Michigan, involved cannabis flower, and in Florida, it involved CBD extracts. And these are all examples of limits exceeding the state-based regulated maximum allowable limits for a whole bunch of elements. And in fact, the one in Florida is going through litigation at the moment. So these things happen. Things are getting into the public domain, which are, which are unsafe. And it's interesting to see whether if the regulations were tighter, whether that would be the case. But they are happening. So let me give you my final thoughts on regulating heavy metals in cannabis consumer products. The current list of 4 heavy metals is clearly inadequate, absolutely inadequate. I'm not saying the 24 regulated by the pharmaceutical industry, that might be a little of an overkill, but I can tell you that elements, contaminants derived from the cultivation, manufacturing, storage, delivery process would warrant at least another 10 elements on top of the big 4. So I think a future list of elemental contaminants in cannabis worthy of consideration. Again, I say worthy of consideration. We need to do a risk assessment study of which ones are actually in the cultivation and manufacturing process. But I'm saying that at least a list of 15 elements based on the big 4 plus the additional elements in Maryland, Michigan, and New York, plus an additional 6 from compelling evidence in the public domain. And the bottom line is most of these would escape the scrutiny of state regulations. Okay, so there's signs that the industry is moving towards an extended panel. 3 examples here. NIST is coming out with a certified reference material for NIST for 13 toxic elements in hemp. This is a certified reference material which will be available this year sometime. I don't exactly know when. But interestingly enough, the list is there and includes uranium. And I've seen early NIST data which shows there's about half a ppm in a hemp standard. I sit on an ASTM D37 committee. We're writing a method for ICP-MS for cannabis and hemp consumer products, and we include 23 elemental contaminants. And finally, USP has just published a draft monograph for CBD for use as an API. So this is only for use as an API in drugs like Epidiolex or drugs that are going through the approval pipeline by the FDA. And to comply with that, you have to show compliance for up to 24 elemental contaminants. So I believe the CBD market will separate out into the really pure stuff, really clean stuff that's used as an API for pharmaceuticals, and then the rest of the stuff, which is probably 95% at the moment, will be used for other purposes. So I'd like to finish with sources of information for my talk. I've written 3 textbooks in this domain on the applications and the fundamentals of ICP-MS. First one is a practical guide to ICP-MS, which came out in 2015. The second one was measuring elemental impurities in pharmaceuticals, which came out in 2018. And my final one I've written, they just came out with a paperback version of that, is measuring heavy metal contaminants in cannabis and hemp, and that's the one in the middle. They're all available on Amazon or through my publishers. And hot off the press, I had an article published in Analytical Cannabis today. It's a 4-part series on the benefits of carrying out a comprehensive risk assessment study to better understand elemental impurities in cannabis and drug products. And that'll be published over the next few weeks. With that, I thank you for your time. I think I've gone over, but I think we started late. Thanks for your time, and I'll gladly answer any of your questions.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. Very, very nice talk. I
Thank
really
you.
learned a lot from you today. I basically want to ask the same question that I asked to the previous speaker who was talking about pediatric use. I was wondering now with the right now we have the regulation at different states. You know, like many of them focus on the big four.
Yeah.
And then all of them, there is no difference between recreational and medical cannabis. Now, even it's for people who are sick. I guess I just want to, you know, like seeing your thought on, should there be a difference between the regulation for the medical, for the, you know, toxic element regulation for medical versus recreational cannabis, given that, you know, of course, we do not, right now the information is so scarce, we don't really know what is out there. But, you know, like for the patient, should there be a difference? And if there should, then how should we proceed to there? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, I mean, my state, for example, Maryland, currently only allows medicinal cannabis use, but they will be approving recreational use next year. And they're concerned that bringing in recreational use will affect the quality and the purity of the medicinal drugs. So I think, you know, based on the fact that I've done a lot of work in the pharmaceutical industry, which is highly regulated, and you know, clearly the pharmaceutical industry was very concerned about producing products which potentially could contain heavy metals, which they weren't even monitoring. So even though it took them 20 years, clearly they saw a need to do that, but not only a need to do it, they needed to comprehensively understand where the contact points for the heavy metals were in the entire manufacturing process. And now every pharmaceutical manufacturer has to show compliance for up to 24 elemental impurities, you know, based on the method of delivery. So I've come from that kind of background, and I've come into the cannabis industry, and I see an industry which is chaotic, it's exciting, but it's so fractured and disjointed. And you know, when you see that recreational use cannabis has exactly the same limits as medicinal use, to me it doesn't make any sense. I mean, for example, I'm working with a group at the moment that's that they suffer from adult epilepsy, and they found relief in vaping CBG. And they approached me because they were concerned. They'd read in the open literature that these vaping devices were showing high levels of elemental contaminants in the aerosol, which were not being regulated based on the metallic components within these vaping devices. So even though they tried conventional drugs for their seizures, and they were finding relief in this CBG in particular, they were extremely concerned, and I'm helping them maybe find a source of these vaping devices which are cleaner, which are less contaminated. I mean, I see now there being these vaping devices, you know, separating up into the ones that are used for the masses, which are coming in the millions from China, and ones which are going to be used for medical purposes. You cannot use the ones coming in from China, because I've seen some data which is scary. And to give someone who's taking CBG for a seizure, and the CBG is relieving their symptoms, but they put in particulates of chromium down their lungs. I mean, to me, that's so scary. You know, I guess I've been immersed in this area for the past 3 years, and I see the mistakes the industry is making, and I'm trying to help them get better. It's very frustrating. But working with groups like ASTM and AOAC, I think we're making some headway, but there's a lot of stuff going on which needs to change. Absolutely.
Regarding the vaporizers, I believe in 2019 there was a presentation here where they went into a lot of detail on the elemental testing of the the vapor coming out. It seemed to come to a different conclusion. I think they said it was fairly low. So I was just curious if you had any insights why that was different.
Okay, you're not talking about the Avali scare in 2019 with vitamin E acetate, are you? Are you
No, I
talking that
believe
one?
they were looking at metals. The presentation here in 2019.
No, okay, so that was the Avali scare where vitamin E acetate was getting into consumers' lungs and killed about 70 people. Yeah, there's been a lot of work done over the past few years in characterizing vaping or aerosol for elemental contaminants. Unfortunately, there is no standard method out there. It is a very complex analysis. You're dealing with diluents, you're dealing with cannabinoids, you're dealing with hydrophobic and hydrophilic liquids. How do you take the aerosol and allow it to make a condensate and take a representative part of that condensate and introduce it into your analytical technique, which is typically ICP-MS? How can you be sure you're taking a representative sample from the tank? Because at different temperatures, the elemental contaminants have different vaporization temperatures. So based on the vaporization temperature, some of the less volatile elements, might not come over, and some of the more volatile elements will come over first. So how do you know what you're sampling is representative of what's in the tank? It's a very complex analysis, and there's no standardized method. Some states are trying to do it. Colorado is leading the charge, but I know they're having some challenges. And you can't give this analysis to a regular testing lab. It's just it's difficult for someone who's had years of experience in trace element analysis. Virtually impossible. I'm not critiquing the testing labs because there's some really good ones out there. But this analysis is so difficult, so challenging, and you have to throw in, you also have to throw in a smoke machine. And how do you know that the puff profile of a cannabis consumer is very similar to an e-cigarette user or a nicotine user? They're not, they're not different. So all the work that's been done up to now has been done on e-cigarettes, nicotine devices, and all of a sudden you're then going to a cannabis device, and a cannabis vapor has a different puff profile. This is so complicated and so difficult that I think it'll be challenging. Sorry. Okay, thanks for your time.
Thank you.